Here.
All right, hey everyone. Today I'm going to dive into the Defend the Guard hearing from North Dakota last week, and I'm going to be watching and breaking down all of the fear-mongering and the inaccuracies being pushed by unelected bureaucrats and members of the executive branch and the lobbyists on behalf of the Department of Defense. These are the same tactics that are showing up at hearings all across the country, which means they're coming from a single source somewhere, and I'm sure that single source is the National Guard Bureau. So stick with me as I call out the fallacies and I give you the truth behind the arguments. All right, let's get into it.
All right, sounds good. House Bill 1315 will open up the hearing. Jackson.
House Bill 1315 is a bill for an act relating to the deployment of the North Dakota National Guard and to declare an emergency.
Representative Heilman, welcome to GVA.
Chairman Schauer, members of the committee, I would say that it's good to see you again, but I've never been in front of this committee before, so now I can say I have.
We're very nice people most of the time.
Yeah. Chairman Schauer in his head is thinking you're about to regret coming to this committee. Kidding. It's good to see you all, seriously. But my name is Matt Heilman. I'm a state representative from North Dakota's 7th Legislative District in Bismarck. I'm here today to testify in favor of House Bill 1315. This bill is to help bring us back to our constitutional foundation. In this bill, it says unless Congress exercises their constitutional authority under Clause 15 of Section 8 of Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution, the North Dakota National Guard may not be deployed into active duty combat as defined in the bill. This bill would not restrict the ability of the governor to deploy the National Guard for civil authority missions. They would just not be able to go into active duty combat.
I want to talk about that for a second. So he says the bill would not restrict the ability for the governor to deploy the National Guard for civil authority missions. That's exactly right, Matt. So this bill is laser focused on ensuring that the National Guard isn't deployed into combat without Congress doing its job first, declaring war. It's not about tying the hands of state leadership for any domestic missions, emergencies, or the defense of their home states, which is the crucial part of what the Guard does so well. All right, let's go back.
House Bill 1315 not only addresses the abandonment of the U.S. Constitution in the modern day, but it also addresses the issues of endless wars and the sanctity of life. Our last constitutional war was in World War II. In 1950, President Harry Truman deployed soldiers to fight in Korea.
Think about that for a second. Truman cited the United Nations as the supreme authority for our military. The last constitutional war was World War II, 1943. And it's a great point. I'm glad he brought it up because we hope to be able to rely on this later in the testimony. And we'll see what happens. But I'm sure we'll hear more about it. Opponents of the bill say that the AUMF that we went to war in Afghanistan and Iraq over, or any executive authority with absent a declaration of the war, is the same thing, but it's just not. Representative Heilman's right. And this point is important. They're not the same thing.
He saw no declaration of war from Congress and claimed the United Nations empowered him to engage in, quote, police actions, unaccountable to the people's representatives. And we've heard the term policing the world quite a bit in the last 20 years especially.
Over 36,000 GIs died in Korea. During the Korean War, the legislature of North Dakota actually passed a resolution demanding that Congress act to bring all troops and military personnel home from the peninsula and end the fighting. Governor Norman Brunsdale also demanded a withdrawal of military recruiters from our state. My great uncle actually fought and died in the Korean War.
Great way to tie it in, make it personal.
My grandpa also served in the Korean War as well. So this issue is near and dear to my heart. This legislation has been supported by many notable people, including the Director of National Intelligence nominee, Tulsi Gabbard, Secretary of Health and Human Services nominee, RFK Jr., U.S. Senator Rand Paul,
one of the greats.
U.S. Senator Tim Sheehy, recently elected in Montana, and Congressman Thomas Massey. One of the biggest supporters of this legislation is actually the current nominee for the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth.
He did get nominated. That happened right before I made this video.
To the Secretary of Defense, that is going to be huge in this movement. And this legislation has been introduced in many states and has been passed in one chamber so far in the following states of Idaho, Arizona, and New Hampshire. I included an attachment at the very end of my testimony that I emailed to all of you this morning of all the National Guard members who have served and died since 2001. This is a real issue where people are actually dying in this state and from this state. And what for? That's the big question, right? So 14 souls, 14 of them have left this world. And many of these people who died were around my age, as you can see in the testimony. It specifies the age that they were at when they died and the cause of death. The justification for the invasion of Iraq, for example, was that they had weapons of mass destruction. And we all know how that ended up not being
old
true.
Dick did us dirty.
8 of the 14 members of the North Dakota National Guard at the end of my testimony died in Iraq. And the United States spent 20 years in Afghanistan until President Biden pulled out all the troops in 2021. 20 years. I'm 23. That's pretty much my entire lifetime. What did North Dakota or our National Guard benefit from these wars? Did the families and loved ones of the 14 people also benefit? I would say probably not. President Eisenhower actually warned us against the military-industrial complex in his farewell address, saying, quote, "In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist." I also believe, actually, that if this legislation does pass, it will increase recruitment in the National Guard, because then people will know that they won't have to be fighting in unconstitutional wars or go into countries like Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah, that's a great point. I want to talk about that because it doesn't get brought up enough. I particularly believe that those who join to protect their state and serve their community in emergencies, as well as a sense of patriotic duty to their country, they raise their hand and swear an oath to the Constitution of the United States. The least that we can do before sending them off to do such a thing, to write a check up to the value of their own life, before we send them to do that, we should use that same authority of the Constitution that they so willingly honor and sacrifice for. It's a great point. I think we miss out on many opportunities to talk about it.
And you'll hear many opposing arguments coming, but the fact of the matter is the U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and the Constitution says that Congress has to declare war. And that's really the intention of this bill, is to get back to that founding document. And one of the other main arguments you'll hear around this bill is losing federal funding. From what I've seen as of 6 a.m. this morning, there was no fiscal note attached to this bill.
What a great point for Matt to bring out, that as the moment of the hearing, they haven't even willingly provided a fiscal note about the bill, but they're all going to come here and testify about how much money it's going to cost the state. They're all liars because they won't put their name on it. They are not willing to put their name and say, I say it will cost this much money, because then they know we can go to the Department of Defense and ask for clarification and know that they'll be lying. It's all conjecture and it's all fear-mongering.
And I don't see where our military is actually defunded. I think it's incredibly unpopular, as we saw with the recent movement in the last few years about defunding the police, and I think that was unpopular across the entire board. And even if there was a loss in federal funding, I think we have to ask the question, is that money worth losing the lives of our fellow North Dakotans in unconstitutional wars? Mr. Chairman, I did see there was some opposition from the National Guard of a dollar amount. I'm not sure of the breakdown of that. That would be a question more.
All right, great. Hey, no, this is awesome. States like North Dakota shouldn't have to choose between constitutional principles and federal dollars. Again, this is a point that we should be making. Instead of trying to counter their arguments about funding, we should make that point. We swear an oath to the Constitution, not to federal dollars, right? I think that Heilman's done a good job. He made a principled argument rooted in the Constitution, and he backed up with historical precedent. He made some personal connections, and he pointed out that our last constitutional war was World War II, and it really sets the stage for why this bill is necessary. It's not because what we do now is just the standard practice. It demonstrates that since we did it the right way in World War II, we haven't won a war yet, right? We're 0-19 or whatever the number is in undeclared wars. And it's time that we start talking about that and the reason why. Is it causation or is it correlation or is it a little bit of both? His emphasis on the stakes, right? On both in terms of lives lost and the need for proper oversight. I think it was powerful, it was well done, and it sets up an important discussion as we move into the rest of the hearing. So let's keep going.
For them, but I can certainly stand for any questions.
Well, I know you have somebody online, right? An expert.
I believe so. Yeah. I emailed.
Do you have that, Timothy? Is that person ready to go?
I sent an email to...
No.
I sent an email to Jackson this morning asking for the link to testify online, and I CC'd him. So I don't know if Jackson saw that yet or not.
Okay, so at this point, we don't have that person, so...
Okay.
All right. And, if we can get him, we'll make every effort, as I mentioned to you. So questions for Representative Heilman?
For the record, I've been trying for almost an hour to get online to testify at this hearing, and it was just clunky and we couldn't get it done. I finally had to call the secretary and work it out over the phone. And so my testimony comes up a little bit later, which probably is actually more advantageous.
Any opposition to
Now we're going to hear
House
from
Bill
a representative, I believe it's
1315?
Jeremy Olson from the North Dakota State House, former guardsman. Let's hear what he has to say.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the Government and Veteran Affairs Committee. I'm Jeremy Olson, State Representative 26, representing most of McKenzie and Dunn counties. I'm a former North Dakota National Guard soldier, former active duty Army officer. Thank you for the opportunity to address you today. I stand before you to urge the rejection of the Defend the Guard proposed legislation of House Bill 1315. While the intentions behind this bill may be rooted in concern for our national sovereignty and the protection of our service members, it is my belief that the bill is fundamentally flawed and would have unintended negative consequences for both our national defense and the veterans who have served this country honorably. First and foremost, House Bill 1315 seeks to restrict state National Guard units from being deployed overseas
For combat.
military operations. On the surface, this may seem like an effort to safeguard the interests of states and their citizens. But in practice, it could severely hamper our military's ability to respond to national security threats quickly and effectively. Our military, particularly the National Guard, plays a vital role in a wide range of operations, from national disaster relief to combat missions
One declared by
overseas.
Congress.
National Guard units are often called upon to supplement the active duty during times
Correct.
of crisis, ensuring that we have the necessary resources and manpower to
There he goes.
defend
He's
our
planning
nation.
he planted the seed, right? We need the resources, the money to be able to fulfill our duty to our state, right? And the way that he's going to present this is to plant the seed about losing the funding, apply it to the pressures that North Dakota would feel as a state, and then somehow tie it to the federal authority. It's a circular argument, and he has no way of getting off this ramp.
By requiring state legislators to approve overseas deployment, this bill creates unnecessary delays and bureaucratic hurdles in situations that demand immediate action.
Oh, hold on. He said let me make sure I get this right. By requiring state legislators to approve overseas deployments, this bill creates unnecessary delays and bureaucratic hurdles in situations that demand immediate action. That is a red herring. Folks, this is the biggest lie so far. All right, we're 14 minutes into this hearing, and here's the lie. The bill does not require legislators to approve overseas deployments. That's the first lie. He's trying to create a red herring. He's trying to say we will be in danger because we will have to convene the state legislature to approve the National Guard participating in overseas war. That's fallacy. So let's clarify this. The bill does not require state legislators to approve anything. They're setting a law that says that Congress must declare war before the Guard units are sent into combat. It has nothing to do with any other emergencies, emergency declarations by the president, responses to actual threats to the homeland, repelling an invasion, putting down an insurrection, enforcing the laws of the Union. None of the things that the National Guard is actually constitutionally created to do is affected by this bill except fighting in undeclared wars. This is masterclass. He's showing you exactly how the deep state, bureaucratic, unelected bureaucratic officials and career politicians spin the narrative to get your emotions riled up instead of talking about the facts. So it's funny how a simple requirement like following the Constitution is suddenly bureaucratic. Think about this for a second. I don't think upholding the supreme law of the land would be such a hurdle. Let's get back into this nonsense.
This legislation also raises serious constitutional and legal questions.
We're not going to get very far into this. All right, so the legislation raises serious constitutional and legal questions. let's highlight the fact that the constitutional question has already been answered in Article 1, Section 8, which grants Congress the power to declare war. It's curious how returning to the plain text of the Constitution, which has already been answered, is a serious constitutional question. Maybe the real question is, why is Congress avoiding it? Let's start there.
The U.S. Constitution grants the federal government the power to raise and support armies and to provide for the common defense of the nation. While the National Guard is indeed a state-based institution, its federal mission is equally vital. The federal government, in partnership with the states, ensures that the Guard can function both locally and abroad as necessary.
It's locally, federally, and abroad when properly authorized in Title 10. Title 10 USC code, U.S. code, and I believe it's 12-201, 12-202, 12-303 that talk about the times when the National Guard can actually deploy outside the continental United States with a presidential declaration, a congressional declaration, or an emergency order. Never about war that's not been declared. But nice try there.
Requiring state legislators to approve every overseas deployment could create a patchwork approach to military readiness, where some states may authorize deployments while others do not.
All right, so patchwork, I love this word. So following the same rules nationwide, the Constitution, Congress declaring war, troops deploying with the proper authority is now considered patchwork. I guess that's one of those combat patches I'd actually proudly wear.
This could ultimately undermine the cohesion and effectiveness of the National Guard as a force, creating a situation where the government, federal government, and state governments are at odds over how to respond to national security threats. Moreover, House Bill 1315 could provoke legal challenges that would tie up resources,
We hope so.
divert attention from critical issues, and most importantly, distract us from our overall national security priorities.
What distraction, first of all, could fighting for the Constitution possibly cause? In the state legislature, is it going to interfere with you passing a new version of a license plate or renaming a street in your hometown? What's it going to interfere with? We're talking about the Constitution of the United States and lives of North Dakota citizens. Pound sand, dude.
In conclusion, while House Bill 1315 may stem from a desire to protect the rights of states and their National Guard units, its potential risks to national security, legal stability, and the well-being of our veterans far outweigh any
The well-being
benefits.
of the veterans in
Our
Syria.
primary responsibility as policymakers is to ensure the
Horn of
safety
Africa.
and security of our nation, and this bill stands to undermine that mission. I respectfully ask this committee to reject House Bill 1315 and to work towards solutions that prioritize the readiness and cohesion of our military while respecting the vital contributions of our National Guard members. Thank you for your time and consideration.
Questions for Representative Olson? Representative Steiner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Olson, so is the training different for a full-time Army soldier versus a National Guardsman who comes in once a month? What type of training difference do you have when you go overseas?
Well, it's been over 30 years, Mr. Chairman, Representative Steiner, it's been over 30 years since I went to basic training, but I went to basic training and advanced training with National Guard members, Army Reserve members, and active duty members. The training received following that, following the initial and advanced training, is up to the particular units.
No, it's not. All right. Again, another lie. I won't call it a lie. I'll say he's misinformed. The purpose of the president having federal oversight of the state militias when needed is to ensure a standard of training across the board, from sea to shining sea, Representative. The training is the same. Every soldier receives the same basic individual training, whether they're National Guard, Army Reserve, or active duty Army. Same with Marine Corps, Marine Corps Reserve, Air Force, Air Guard. They all receive the same training, and it's the duty of the federal government under the guise and the commander-in-chief role of the president to ensure that standard in training and equipment is standard across the board so that the troops can be integrated when needed to into a federal mission, a properly authorized federal mission. Grossly misunderstood.
As with active duty units and Guard units, one unit may be different than the other as far as training capabilities and how well they are.
There's somebody who actually
Probably
knows.
defer that question.
It's
to,
okay, representative in the
someone
committee,
who's
if you don't know the answer, to say, I don't
recency
know.
with the National Guard training.
Representative Rohr.
Thank you, Chairman. So Representative Olson, I noticed that in Representative Heilman's testimony, he indicated that there's 3 states where it's passed in one chamber.
Great
Have
question.
you had a chance with your connections to connect with any of the colleagues?
Representative Steiner, great question.
Discuss this with them and get an idea in preparation for your testimony?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Rohr, no, I did not reach out to those states.
All right, thank you.
If you didn't even bother to check with colleagues in other states to find out how they've handled the situation, why should your opinion on the unintended consequences, hold any weight whatsoever? You simply don't know. Your conjecture and your opinion are valued about as much as they're worth. You know,
Thank you for your testimony.
since he's over right now, I want to talk real quick. I thought
We
Representative
do
Olson,
have the,
I thought he did an okay
individual
job as a
online,
proponent.
for,
If these were all the proponents
support
opponent that we faced were all like Representative Olson, this bill would be passing because his argument was fairly weak, and it was about he talked about the bureaucracy of going to war, and I thought it was just a little bit baseless. His argument about the bureaucratic hurdles shows that he sees the Constitution as an inconvenience rather than the supreme law of the land and the foundation of our government. He then tried to suggest that the bill creates a patchwork approach to readiness, and I thought that completely missed that that it actually enforces uniformity by requiring the same constitutional process nationwide. And let's just not forget, he didn't even consult other legislators. So if I'm grading him on a 1 to 10, Representative Olson, I'll give you a 2. Thanks for showing.
Yes, hi, my name is Dan McKnight. I'm the chairman of a veterans organization called Bring Our Troops Home, and we're the national sponsors of the Defend the Guard legislation.
All right, this is after quite some time of technical support. They bring me in, and I've got on my screen where I'm testifying, I have a 2.5 minute countdown. So I have to try and squeeze everything in 2.5 minutes. I hate that standard.
Proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak today in support of Defend the Guard. Like I said, my name is Dan McKnight. I'm a 13-year veteran of the United States military, including a stint in the Marine Corps, the Active Duty Army, and the Idaho Army National Guard. I deployed to the global war on terror in Afghanistan in 2005 through 2007 as a member of the National Guard. I have intimate familiarity with this bill and the role of the National Guard on a world stage and a state and local level. This legislation has received national attention and widespread support from leaders who recognize its importance. When the New Hampshire House of Representatives passed Defend the Guard last year, Pete Hegseth, the current nominee for the Secretary of Defense, said on Fox News, "I love this idea," and his support didn't stop there. Last month, I met with Pete Hegseth in West Palm Beach, Florida, to discuss Defend the Guard. When I asked him his thoughts on the legislation, he said once again, without hesitation, "I love this idea," and he asked what he could do to help.
Check out a picture.
Hegseth understands the value of the legislation, not only for its constitutional fidelity, but also the protection it provides for the men and women of the National Guard. When I explained the opposition that we've encountered, namely thinly veiled threats of loss of federal funding by 1- and 2-star generals representing the National Guard Bureau, he was baffled and he asked, why would anybody possibly argue against this bill? His words are a powerful reminder. This bill is not radical. It's a return to the principles our nation was founded on. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution clearly gives Congress, not the president, not some unelected bureaucrat, the authority to declare war. Yet, for decades, presidents of both parties have ignored this, using the National Guard in conflicts Congress has never authorized. One stark and recent example of this is the Syrian civil war. In 2013, President Obama asked Congress to authorize military action in Syria, and Congress said no. Yet, the administration moved forward anyway, citing the Afghanistan 2001 authorization of use of military force as the authorization to go into Syria. That authorization was meant to target the perpetrators of 9/11. To justify American involvement in Syria is a stretch beyond any imagination. At the beginning of the Syrian civil war, less than 3% of the troops on the ground were from the National Guard, and by the conclusion of the war in 2024, when the Assad regime fell, over 58% of the troops, the U.S. troops on the ground in Syria involved in the war, were from the National Guard. These were ordinary Americans, teachers, firefighters, small business owners, sent to fight in an undeclared war that had grown out of control. Congress never approved it. This misuse of our National Guard must end. That's why Defend the Guard has earned the support of leaders like Pete Hegseth, Senators Rand Paul, Tim Sheehy, like Representative Hyman referenced. Others like Paul Gosar, who's still on the Appropriations Committee in Congress, have said that no single state would lose a penny of federal funding if this bill passed. A punitive action by Congress would never stand.
By the way, real quick, that point about Paul Gosar that I stumbled through and didn't articulate very well, he actually recorded it into the halls of Congress, that the appropriations for the National Guard comes through the Appropriations Committee in Congress. And he happens to sit on that committee. And he said that no congressman would ever punish a state for exercising their constitutional fidelity, their oath or their duty to the Constitution. And they would never lose money for their National Guard because they insisted on Congress doing their job. It's a pretty powerful statement. The other side arguing funding has no such statement. Nobody willing to put their name on anything even close. And that's why I think it's conjecture and it's just fear mongering. And it's really the only thing they have. But it's a powerful tool. And when we try to fight the funding argument, we have to do it from a logical, common sense standpoint.
They all agree that no war should begin without the consent of the American people through their elected representatives. And passing this bill will make North Dakota a leader in standing for the Constitution, for our National Guard, and against the dangerous precedent of these endless and undeclared wars. I urge you to join Pete Hegseth, myself, and all of the supporters of Defend the Guard across the country and pass this bill out of committee and onto the floor for a full vote. Thank you.
I didn't do a very articulate job, but when you have that damn timer ticking in your face, man, I should have been better prepared.
Thank you, Mr. McKnight. We appreciate your testimony. And for the record, North Dakota military policy is not based on Pete Hegseth or anybody else. Thank you for your testimony. Okay.
Oh, Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, but North Dakota military policy is set, in fact, by the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth. Remember the people that came before me, Jared Olson, and I'm sure the people coming after me, I can see the general sitting there. They're going to tell you about the federal role and the federal mission and the dual enlistment of the National Guard and how the federal government and the National Guard are all part of the same force structure. So I understand what you're saying, and I appreciate the comment. I don't appreciate the level of snarkiness that comes with it. But yes, North Dakota military policy is established by the Secretary of Defense. As an example, when your National Guardsmen, our National Guard, started kicking out National Guard soldiers because they wouldn't take the COVID vaccine, even though it was never proven to be effective, you did so because the Department of Defense told you to. So we don't get to play both sides of this coin, Mr. Chair.
Continue testimony in opposition to HB 1315.
Oh, here comes the general. You can't handle the truth. You want me on that podium.
Good morning, Chairman Schauer, members of the committee. I'm Brigadier General Mitch Johnson, Adjutant General for the North Dakota National Guard, and I'm here to testify in opposition of House Bill 1350.
Shocker.
Our United States military is a total force made up of active duty National Guard and reserves. The National Guard is the primary combat reserve of the Army and the Air Force. As Adjutant General, my main mission is to ensure the United States and the state of North Dakota have a trained and ready force. I have over 1,000 federally funded full-time employees who help me organize, train, and equip your men and women of the North Dakota National Guard. Additionally, I have hundreds of millions of dollars of federal equipment for my federal mission sets.
Real quick, you don't have federal dollars or federal equipment. You have the people of the United States dollars and the people of the United States equipment. Let's just keep that point in mind.
If House Bill 1315 were to pass, North Dakota would become the only state where the federal government can no longer access the Guard unless Congress passed a declaration of war.
Okay, here it comes. He's getting ready to lay it on. So the bill does not block federal access from the National Guard. It prevents Guard deployments to combat without a congressional authorization. So let me get it straight. The only state insisting that Congress follow the Constitution is the problematic one? That's the stepchild that needs to be beaten? I don't understand. Maybe North Dakota should be the trendsetter here.
With this declaration of war restriction in place, I would expect senior department defense leaders to direct equipment and missions to other
Name one.
states that are willing to support the national defense.
Okay, notice what he said. I would expect senior defense leaders to direct equipment. He doesn't say who, he doesn't say how, he doesn't give an example of it ever happening. I would expect it to be this way because the National Guard Bureau sent out their notice to all of their adjutant generals telling them these are your talking points, and he's delivering them perfectly. Well done, General.
Defense mission. Additionally, I would expect that a significant number of Guardsmen would leave North Dakota and join units in neighboring states or join the reserves because my Guardsmen want to do their mission.
My Guardsmen want to do their missions. I don't disagree with that whatsoever. Their missions, the National Guard, on the National Guard Bureau's website, on every recruiting paper you see, and in the Constitution that sets up the authority for the National Guard, their mission is to repel an invasion, to put down an insurrection, and to enforce the laws of the Union. Fighting an undeclared overseas war of choice should only be done if Congress has declared it and given the proper authority to that war. You're right. 18-year-olds want to run headlong into war, General. That's why we have wise and prudent civilian control of the military and put the proper checks and balances and forethought into it before we send them marching into such a war.
For the Guardsmen I would have left, I would expect to receive a reduction in funding for exercises and training. In a very short amount of time, I would expect to struggle with recruiting, morale, funding, and readiness. Currently, your North Dakota National Guard is viewed with respect across our state and nation. I have Guardsmen that are nationally recognized as leaders in their career fields and who are an example of how to do things right.
Oh, example of how to do things right. General, that's all we're asking, is that we do things the right way. I want to go back real quick. When he says our Guardsmen want to do their mission, I think it's important that many join their National Guards to protect their state, serve their communities, and to defend their nation. Not to be pawns in a foreign policy quagmire like Syria or Yemen or the Horn of Africa, Djibouti, Eastern Europe, or any of the other places where National Guard is participating in undeclared wars. So these wars are governed by convoluted rules of engagement where they can't do their job. They're convoluted by oversight from bureaucrats who are in suits and ties, JAG attorneys who are quick to pull the trigger and finger and prosecute young men in uniform who may have taken overly aggressive actions to defend themselves and their fellow soldiers. Yes, they want to do their job, but their job should be to go and win America's wars and then come home. And that's the problem when we don't have a declaration of war from Congress. I don't think anybody would really be buying what you're selling if you didn't have on the uniform with the ribbons and stars. So none of the conflicts that you're talking about can honestly be claimed as wars that these young men signed up or wanted to serve in. And none of them ended in victory, by the way, General. Our win-loss record in undeclared wars isn't great. Young people want to deploy and contribute. But once again, that's why we have wise civilian control of the military to curb the testosterone-driven enthusiasm of young men who are eager to charge headlong into any conflict for the sake of adventure and patriotism. The military is not a battering ram. It's a shield to defend America. And we don't send our best and our brightest into war, into the armpit of the world, like the Hindu Kush Mountains in Afghanistan, just because they want to go. These young men swore an oath to the Constitution, not to endless wars, not to quagmires, not to failed foreign policies, not to unrealistic rules of engagement. Shame on you, General, for suggesting otherwise.
The North Dakota way. The support we currently receive from the North Dakota legislature has been instrumental in providing well-trained military teams ready to carry out our national defense mission. In return, the state receives the benefit of 4,100 professional soldiers and airmen from 200 North Dakota communities, all ready to serve our state during times of need. Additionally, our current National Guard missions and force structure have produced an economic...
There it is, right? Chum the water, then drop the $660 million feeding frenzy.
Economic impact of $660 million per biennium. Your legislation and support helps make this possible, and I ask for your continued support and rejection of House Bill 1315. I'll stand for any questions.
Questions for General Johnson? Representative Steiner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Johnson, at one point, well, I'll just say my father was a colonel in the National Guard. So when he worked for them out of Frayne Barracks here in Bismarck in the 70s, he expressed concern on I can't remember if it was Guatemala or Honduras, but I remember how worried he was when the National Guard mission went overseas. And there was a time when National Guard only took care of flood and only took care of domestic.
I don't like that argument. I understand the sentiment behind it, and I think Representative Steiner is asking a good question here. The National Guard is not, their primary mission isn't floods and hurricanes and snowstorms. It's to defend America and Americans, right? And because they are an assembled force at the governor's disposal, they're able to handle those domestic emergencies, weather phenomena, and things like that. The National Guard's primary purpose is the defense of America. So while I understand the sentiment of the argument, I wish we had a better way to articulate it.
Issues. And at some point, the mission changed to help out the regular Army. And I remember his concern for his soldiers and his sleepless nights, and he couldn't wait till they got back in North Dakota. And what year was it the mission changed? Because there was kind of a mission creep of going to
developing nations,
third world countries, if you want to call them that were getting on their feet and doing humanitarian missions for them, like helping them with food and water. And then from there, it started to go.
For the record, also, those humanitarian missions or training missions outside of the continental United States that the National Guard does and does very well. Those are real world missions, real world training to prepare the National Guard to have a footprint in other parts of the world when needed. If a war were to break out in Honduras, for her, using her example, the National Guard training there and preparing there on a semi-regular basis is a good principle, and this bill does not restrict that at all. In fact, that's already been answered by the Supreme Court in the Perpich v. Department of Defense case that says that the National Guard can be deployed outside of the continental United States for the purposes of training at the president's direction without the governor's authorization. So great points, Representative Steiner. I appreciate the question.
A war situation. And he was concerned about the training levels were different because he said the full-time, because he served in Korea, and he said the full-time military, they work at it full-time, and they are ready to go into combat at a different level, but this was in the 70s. Now, it could have changed since that time. So do you have any history of where, I don't want to call it mission creep, but where
good definition.
The National Guard used to be, where they were a defender of the nation, not going to foreign wars?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Steiner, I'll start with, we always have a federal mission. So I can't begin to guess what happened in the 70s, but apparently we were needed federally to help that piece of our federal mission. For instance, helping those countries do that. Right now, or in recent times, we've been needed federally to do a different mission set. So my answer to your question would be our missions have changed, or the requirements the federal government needed from our federal portion of our force had changed.
So, all right, I actually appreciate the general's comments here. He's not wrong. Our federal mission has changed, and it's changed because the mechanism, the safe check, the brake that we had in place to keep us from marching headlong across the globe into undeclared wars of choice is broken, and that's the purpose of this bill, is to fix it. We still believe the National Guard should do all the things that the general wants them to do. We just want to do it with the proper authority. And we'll have fewer of these wars if Congress has to provide the oversight and then go back to their home districts and explain to their constituents why they authorized a war in Syria and why we ended up supporting every side of the war, including Al-Qaeda, who we defeated in Iraq. But then we funded them and helped them win in Syria. I think that representatives should have to go home and explain that to their constituents. But the general's absolutely right here. Our role has changed, and that's what we want to talk about, is if it's going to change, we should rely on the principles that give the authority to the federal government to take the National Guard into war.
Does that make sense to you? I don't think we're doing a lot of work in Central America right now. That, as you described, we're doing work in different areas federally. God, I'm sorry, I just hit my gag reflex. When everybody says we're doing something federally,
it makes me want to throw up because the federal government is 0 for 1 million, I think, is their record in doing good things. So I hate when they say it's a federal mission and therefore it's given this kind of almost a blessing, a sainthood. Hey, because it's for the federal government, it's got to be pure.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, if you could get us a history of the National Guard and how it's changed over the years, because to my recollection, growing up, it's
You're not wrong,
changed.
Representative.
And it's, yeah.
Further questions for General Johnson? General, this Defend the Guard movement, overall, how do you view it as hurting our national security?
Oh, what a softball layup question.
Mr. Chairman, I'll use the MQ-9 mission in Fargo as an
good.
example. Those are remotely piloted aircraft that we can operate overseas from here. If the way I read House Bill 13, we would not be allowed to operate in combat outside the state. That mission would be that mission would lose its orders. So it would everyone who's currently operating that mission set would not be on a military order anymore. They'd have to go back to a strategic reserve or not more of a reserve status and just drill and train. I would expect the orders that they receive to go to other states, probably some of the resources.
Okay, once again, this is him just literally making stuff up. The MQ-9 mission in Fargo would be impacted, without a doubt. That's the point of the bill. If National Guard soldiers are flying drone missions from Fargo, North Dakota, in other parts of the world, and dropping bombs on sovereign nations who we are not at war with, that's the point of this bill. Right? If they're dropping them on wedding parties in retaliation because Joe Biden was so asleep and so just infirmed that he couldn't make a logical military decision, and because Lloyd Austin was the most incompetent Secretary of Defense we had, and they literally planned a retaliation bomb attack on who they said perpetrated the attacks on Abbey Gate in Afghanistan when we withdrew, that failed miserable withdrawal. Their reaction was to bomb a wedding party and kill women and children. And they did it from an MQ-9 drone, by the way, General. I don't know if it was a North Dakota National Guardsman flying that drone or not, but that's the purpose of this bill. We waged war without authorization from Congress, whether it's from Fargo or from Kuwait or Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria. It doesn't matter. Serving as an instrumentality of war in a war that is not authorized is criminal. And I don't want our soldiers to face those type of things. Yeah, so I think we just need to be careful when we talk about these missions and people not getting to participate in them, and that they would have to go back to reserve status. General, you know it's not true. Drones can still fly missions. They can still train. They still need to be prepared for America's defense. We're just saying that they should be flying over in the mountains of Afghanistan, bombing people in retaliation for Joe Biden's failed pullout in Afghanistan.
And then I would expect some of the folks in our mission to follow that because they do like to accomplish that mission. So I would expect a mission set to move, and I would expect people to follow.
And when you're recruiting, are you telling new recruits that there's potential they could go outside of North Dakota in their duties and in their responsibilities?
Mr. Chairman, absolutely. One of the first things they do is swear allegiance to their oath to the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of North Dakota, which symbolizes the federal mission and the state mission of the Guard, singularly of the Guard.
It's interesting. He asked if you tell them that they will be fighting in unconstitutional wars, and he says, yes, they swore an oath to the Constitution. I was going to let this go, but I can't. Question, General, in your recruiting materials, do you tell potential recruits that they may have to leave North Dakota and participate in unconstitutional wars overseas? Yes, the first thing they do is raise their hand and swear an oath to the state of North Dakota and to the Constitution of the United States. Wait a minute. There's a little bit of disjointed connective tissue there. I think the General is whitewashing the point that was asked of him, and it was kind of gross how he did it. I think his testimony is a perfect example of why civilian oversight of the military actually exists. His arguments were riddled with fallacies and misdirection and quite a bit of fear-mongering. And let's address his statement one more time that North Dakota would become the only state where the federal government can no longer access the Guard unless Congress passes a declaration of war. That is true if we're talking about participating in war overseas. That is absolutely false for every other situation where the National Guard might be accessed, for border security, for riot control, for insurrections, for COVID response, for pandemics, for weather emergencies, for actual defense of America, for weather balloons from China flying over 2/3 of our country, from submarines off the coast, from drones flying over our states. Those are all things that the National Guard is there for and should be used. And let's not forget that if war is committed against the United States, a condition of war exists, and the National Guard should be activated under federal control to fight and win those wars. It is when we decide to go off into foreign land and fight a war of choice, an offensive war, that's when we need a declaration of war. Defending the homeland, there is no such requirement. Any attack on America and our homeland, the National Guard is immediately under the control of the federal government should the president need them. So it's outright dishonest. This bill doesn't block federal access to the Guard. It simply requires Congress to declare war, just like the Constitution mandates. Then there was this suggestion that federal funding and equipment would disappear if the state passed the legislation. But essentially, he's implying that the Pentagon is going to punish North Dakota for following the Constitution, which is absurd. It's coercion. It's disguised as an argument, but it's really not. And are we seriously supposed to believe that the Pentagon is so petty that it withhold training dollars unless North Dakota rubber stamps some unconstitutional deployments? If that's true, it's a scandal much bigger than anything that General Johnson claims that this bill would cause. But I think perhaps maybe the most troubling part of General Johnson's performance is the fact that he's lobbying while in uniform, which raises some serious ethical and legal questions. I might get this wrong because it's been a while since I served, but I believe it was the Department of Defense Directive 1344 point something. The active duty service members are prohibited from engaging in partisan political activities or lobbying for or against legislation while in uniform. And take a peek. I'm pretty sure that's a uniform we're seeing, and he wore it for effect, which is the purpose of the directive, is that effect should not have the military playing politics. Yet here we have a general, just like we have in other states, in uniform, lobbying against a bill in the State House, clearly crossing the line. All right, so by wearing the uniform and leveraging his rank and his awards in this way, he risks discrediting the armed forces and violating the trust in the people that he serves. All right, finally, he had one more argument about the Guard members wanting to do their missions, and it completely misses the point. Yes, you're right. Guard members want to serve. They don't want to sign up to be pawns in a foreign policy quagmire like Syria or Yemen or Afghanistan. These young men and women, they swear an oath to the Constitution not to endless wars directed by bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., and the corporate profiteers who ultimately are the only winners. Let's not forget the convoluted rules of engagement that the Secretary of Defense in past administrations, that generals like yourself, and that other people in Congress have insisted on. These rules that have lined up now a generation of JAG attorneys who are eager to prosecute soldiers because they aggressively defend themselves and their fellow service members. All of these things make wars unwinnable and senseless. General Johnson's testimony here, guys, it wasn't just dishonest. I think it was inappropriate, it's coercive, and quite frankly, it's a perfect example of why we need to defend the Guard. This bill ensures that the National Guard is used in the way that the Constitution intended, to defend America, not to fight in undeclared wars in the armpits of the world at the whim of either an elected executive or an unelected bureaucrat and war profiteers who they serve. Sorry, a little bit of a rampage there. I apologize.
We've had loss of life, as was pointed out, but in your opinion, has there been tremendous contribution from North Dakota National Guard soldiers in the various fights and wars and operations that they've conducted?
Mr. Chairman, absolutely. We serve, as I've said, right alongside active and Guard. If you go overseas, and I've been there 6 different times, you look at name tapes and you don't know who's in the National Guard or who's in the active force. We have resources to train to the same level. We have exercises that can get us there, and then we serve right alongside them overseas. I really want to stress the teamwork portion of the military. At one point, maybe the military was in maybe more different silos, maybe what Representative Steiner described before, but it is much more of a total force right now with a total country.
I agree, and it should be.
Representative Christie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Still going.
Difference in pay for these individuals if they are deployed or in any capacity versus just a reservist?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Christie, absolutely. When we're deployed on active duty, we're on a Title 10 status and we're paid exactly the same as an active force. We're effectively on active duty. When I have a guardsman who maybe is a pure guardsman, drilling 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks a year, they're paid just for those days that they serve.
If I could continue.
Yes.
So this would directly affect the pay benefits for them if they are not able to be deployed.
I don't know how this question is going to end, but I know the answer.
Representative Christie, when they deploy, they get the full range of federal benefits. So yes, it comes with health care. It comes with some education benefits depending on how long they serve with the post 9/11 GI Bill.
So he didn't even answer the question. He just platitude. All right. The question was, if Defend the Guard passes, will it affect the pay of National Guard soldiers when on active duty? That was the question. The answer was, when on active duty, we get all these things, pay, blah, 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 blah. So the implication is, yes, it will affect it. The answer should have been this, General, and this is just from a point of clarity, take it or leave it. When the question was asked, the answer should have been no, because when we're on Title 10, we are entitled to the full slate of compensation benefits that all active duty members of the military get. The answer was simple, General, no, right? But instead of saying yes or no, you avoid that altogether and point out the benefits of being on active duty as if those will be gone if the bill passes. It's a sleight of hand trick. You're nothing more than a street magician.
Representative Rohr.
Thank you, Chairman. So, General, could we get some data in terms of how many times our Guard has been asked to do a federal mission? Just to get an idea of the volume that it would impact if this bill should pass.
Yeah, Representative Shaw, Representative Rory, absolutely. I can get you information. How far back would that like to be? Because I would probably be limited in my ability to go too far back.
Just the biennium?
Okay.
What do you think? 20 years? 20 years, would that be too much? Let's go 10 years.
Okay.
We'll use AI on that.
We'll use AI.
General Johnson, thank you for your testimony.
Chairman, hey, why don't you use AI and quickly ask it on a question about the constitutional merits of Defend the Guard and the inappropriateness of sending the military overseas for all these years without a proper declaration of war. Use your AI for that.
I don't think so.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Al Dorman. I'm with the Governor's Office. I'm also a veteran. I've served both on active duty and the National Guard. I don't want to repeat everything that's been said already, but some of the questions that have already been raised, I can maybe provide some additional information. You know, as far as for Representative Steiner, your father's
Hey, just real quick, Al Dorman, he's a retired general, major general, former adjutant general of North Dakota. I believe he was also a JAG attorney at one time. But this is a man with some serious credentials, but now he works in the governor's office, another member of the executive branch, and he's here in the committee in the legislature, the people's branch, where laws are made, providing influence and lobbying on behalf of the executive branch. Again, if you don't see the problem with this, we need to have a civics lesson and go all the way back to the very beginning on maybe like the PBS special on how bills are made.
Experience in the 70s. You know, things change over time as policy changes. And during the 70s, following the Vietnam War, General Creighton Abrams, who was the Chief of Staff of the Army, said the biggest mistake we made in Vietnam was not calling up the Guard. Because when you call up the Guard, you call up every zip code in the United States.
Agreed.
And if you want to make sure that you're doing what your citizens want you to do, you need that touch base. And he said it was a huge mistake not calling out the Guard.
Oh my God. I think I missed this live when the hearing was on. Thank you, General Dorman. You're right. If you want that kind of buy-in from the American people, you need to get their support through their informed consent, which we've given to Congress. Our representatives in Congress have that buy-in for us. So using the National Guard to lobby for support from the citizenry is backwards. All right? The way it's supposed to work is the citizenry, us, gave our authority to our elected members of Congress. You know, it's a Republican form of government. It's a representative democracy. They then take our authority, our will, our informed consent, and they go to Washington, D.C., and they debate the merits of a war. And then they vote on it, which should represent the will of their constituency. And then the National Guard should be called up to fight in that war if so declared. That's how it works. Dragging the National Guard into war to get the support of the community is wrong and it's immoral. And General Dorman, you made a great point, but what you don't realize is that you advocated for one of the most un-American things I think I've ever heard in a hearing. I'm going to clip this thing and we're going to share it.
As far as the history of the Guard being part of the active force in times of national and international crisis, I would remind the committee that our militia, which turned into the North Dakota National Guard, fought during the Spanish-American War, during the Philippine insurrection, where 9 North Dakotans earned the Medal of Honor. During World War I, the 1st North Dakota Infantry deployed in support of that World War. In World War II, our 164th Infantry Regiment was the first Army unit to engage the enemy in offensive operations
in Guadalcanal.
Long before General Patton landed in Africa, our North Dakota Guardsmen were engaged in the Pacific Theater.
But long after Congress had declared war there, sir.
All the way through till the end of the war. So this has always been the case.
You're right. The North Dakota National Guard did fight in all those wars, but you know what? Here's the irony, General. All of those were authorized by Congress. Hey, you know, I actually am not going to gloss over this. I was going to let it go, but thank you so much, General, for making that point. These were all declared wars. You're proving that Defend the Guard doesn't break tradition. It restores it. See, we're in alignment here, and I don't even think you know it. We firmly believe that if a threat is so important to the security of the United States of America and our citizens, then Congress should declare war, and the National Guard should be the force that goes and defends America, fights our wars, and wins America's wars. The Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, they highlight this perfectly. Congress did their job. The National Guard exemplified their role in a way that you are accurately demonstrating. And as far as the Philippine insurrection, it wasn't a war, but the Philippines were a territory of the United States, subject to our laws. And when there was an insurrection in an American territory, the military acted to put it down. And the only available branch of the military to do that legally is the National Guard. One of 3 constitutionally defined roles of the National Guard is to put down suppress an insurrection, repel an invasion, and to enforce the laws of the Union. So thank you, actually, General, for clarifying that we have a proper constitutional mechanism for deploying the National Guard into legitimate wars. The irony is that you can't even see it. You're blinded by, I don't know, was that a flower tie of some sort in your well-tailored 1990s Brooks Brothers suit? But we'll proceed.
When you join the National Guard, as General Johnson said, you take 2 oaths, one to the federal constitution, one to the state constitution. There are legal processes to bring the Guard into the active force. Declaration of war has sometimes happened, but there are authorities there that can allow the Guard to be brought on to active duty. Congress, during the Iraq War, gave the president the authority to call up soldiers for that conflict, but they did not declare war.
Sorry, he's talking about some legal principles being well established beyond a declaration of war. Congress gave the president authority for Iraq, but they didn't declare war. So, General, let's make a quick correction. Authorizations of use of military force is not the same as a declaration of war. The Constitution specifically assigns the power to declare war to Congress and Congress alone. So the decision to go to war belongs to our representatives, and an AUMF is just our representatives giving away, abdicating their responsibility entirely and telling the president that he can make the decision whether or not to go to war. It hands that decision to a single person, and that's not the way it's supposed to be. Congress essentially then promises that if you do decide to go to war, Mr. President, we're going to write you a blank check for any amount of money so you can go for any length of time to anywhere that you choose. That's not how the Founding Fathers ever envisioned this, and the process has been enshrined in our Constitution, General. Just because Congress rubber stamped the president's quote-unquote authority in an AUMF in 2001 and 2003, it doesn't give the president the power to expand that to 4 continents, nearly 100 countries, and 24 years of perpetual conflict. I need you to hear that. Delegating their duty is the issue here, and that's what we're trying to fix. Defend the Guard is about making Congress do their job.
So Congress still had a say in that process, but they have given the President and the Secretary of Defense certain authorities. There's been talk about, well, don't worry about the federal funds. They're not going to cut off your federal funds. North Dakota's in a great position because we have a senator on the Senate Defense Appropriations Committee and one on the Senate Armed Services Committee. So they have a policy guy and an appropriator.
Yep, and those 2 senators, thank you, would never let one single penny of funds to prepare North Dakota for real defense and real readiness and real emergencies be siphoned away to other states because the state decided to stand up for their own authority.
But if the federal government, if the DOD cannot access our forces, they are not going to resource us to train them to the level that they need to be to do their mission.
Hold on. Did he say North Dakota wouldn't be a priority for resources or missions? All right. We haven't had a chance to talk about this yet, so I'm glad we'll bring it up. Resource allocation should not depend on states violating the Constitution. Do we need a better argument than that? States that insist on playing by the rules don't deserve resources. Is that what you're saying, General? That logic belongs in a middle school debate, not a state policy debate. As mentioned in the prior general, his testimony, the National Guard is part of the overall United States Department of Defense force structure. All right. So we spread the gunpowder out over 50 states so that every state has a robust domestic force, and the active duty military has a reserve component ready built to deploy for real world authorized defense missions. See, your argument that we are a part of a force structure involves the states also having their share of that structure. The federal government cannot and will not punish a state and make them unable to respond to real emergencies or defense of their own citizens because of a punitive action because the state passes a piece of legislation. But I want you to think about this, General. I think you are caught in the middle of circular argument here. You're struggling to find an exit and get off and tie it all together and make it make sense. But I'm just going to make a suggestion. When you get to the exit on your little circular argument that comes right by the Constitution, put your blinker on and change lanes. You'll be okay.
And the reason that the Guard can respond and put out fires in western North Dakota on a moment's notice is because they have federal equipment and training, and they take that federal training and they use it for a state emergency. If we don't have the training dollars, even if we have the equipment, those crews may not be trained to the level that you need them to put out that fire. So, yeah, we can guess what may happen if we pass this, but if the federal government, if the Department of Defense cannot access our soldiers and airmen, they're going to have to put their resources where they can get access to the forces they need for whatever may come our way.
Again, here's the circular argument. We don't know if it's going to happen, what I'm telling you about funding, but if it does, they won't be able to access, so they're going to move us to another state because they couldn't get access to our troops, so they cut off our funding, so we didn't have equipment, so they couldn't access us. See, it's a circular argument, General. You're relying on your own fallacies.
So I do have concerns about that. It was discussed about the guardsmen that we have lost in the global war of terror. I know pretty much every one of those families personally. Every family is different. Every family grieves differently. Every family feels different about their sons or daughters' contribution to our national defense in our state. I can tell you a lot of those families are incredibly proud of their service members' service. So I don't really want to bring them into this conversation.
All right. I'm going to handle this as delicately as I can. He says these families are proud of their service members' contributions, but I don't want to drag them into this discussion after he just talked about them and how he knows them personally, and each family grieves and mourns differently. Pride of service is valid. It's one of the most proud things I have in my life is my time serving. The issue is whether these wars were justified, legal, or necessary, and bringing in the emotions and then the dignity, or I'm not self-righteousness, general, of not being willing to drag them into the argument after you just willingly brought them in yourself. No one doubts the valor of our service members or the pride of their families, but we do have to answer this question. Were these wars worth the cost? See, valor and pride don't justify sending National Guard into conflicts that Congress hasn't approved. We honor the service, and I'm going to say this again, we honor the service by demanding that leaders follow the Constitution and only send the troops when it's absolutely necessary and with the informed consent of the American people. That's how we honor their service, by having few of them come home in flag-covered boxes.
As far as what the defense secretary nominee might think, I used to be a lawyer, that's hearsay, so I don't put much weight on that.
He is, it's not hearsay, it's a matter of national record. He said it live on Fox News. And as far as calling it hearsay, General, that's fine. Stand by.
So again, the governor's office does not support this bill. There are legal
executive branch lobbying the legislature.
There are
authorities in place that everything that has happened in the last 20 years and beyond have been legal. There has been challenges to the federal government's legal authority. I think Representative Steiner brought up Honduras. Minnesota challenged a deployment to Honduras back in the late 70s.
For training.
That went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, the federal government does have the authority to call out National Guard for missions like Honduras.
Training.
So those legal principles are well established. If we want to challenge how Congress and the Department of Defense and the President call up guardsmen for these federal missions, using the National Guard in North Dakota is the vehicle to have that discussion is the wrong approach. Have that outside of the National Guard, but don't use the North Dakota National Guard as the vehicle to have this broader policy discussion. And I'll stop there and be happy to take any of your questions.
Questions for General Dorman? General Dorman, this movement is called Defend the Guard. What do you think of that title?
Mr. Chairman, to be honest, it's a marketing ploy. We're not defending the Guard. We're restricting the President and the Secretary of Defense from accessing resources they may need to promote our national policy or defend our sovereignty. And I believe it's also arguably unconstitutional. I don't know if it's Section 2 of the bill that orders the governor not to comply with any order. But beyond that, again, even if we keep all of our soldiers and airmen, even if we kept all our equipment, which I find hard to believe if federal government can't access it.
Again, feelings.
We're not going to be a priority for any new missions. We're not going to be a priority for resourcing. We're not going to be a priority for building new facilities like an armory in Jamestown. Because why would you put your money someplace where you can't get a return on that investment.
General, again, you're lying, because priority for new missions, this bill, the only thing it interferes with is the ability for the federal government, Department of Defense, or the executive branch to take North Dakota National Guardsmen into wars of choice that are not declared. All other missions, state partnership program, humanitarian, overseas training, national defense, insurrections, all of it, none of it's affected. The only thing is we're asking is that before we go to war, we do the one thing that they're actually required to do, declare war. Stop your lying.
And from a governor's standpoint, well, from a state standpoint, if we don't have those highly trained soldiers and airmen, it will impact our ability to respond to disasters and crises in North Dakota. Lately, whenever we have a problem in North Dakota, the solution is usually a Black Hawk helicopter with something hanging out underneath it. Whether it's a sandbag or a bucket full of water, that's the solution. That's a capability the federal government is providing the state of North Dakota.
You're right.
And they're providing all the resources to train those pilots, crew chiefs, and maintainers to get those aircraft up so they can get them on scene. You can make a strong argument that the National Guard with Black Hawks and something hanging out underneath them over the last 10 years have kept the town of Cavalier from going 1 foot underwater, kept the town of Medora from burning up, and prevented a lot of property loss and potentially loss of life in western North Dakota during the wildfires this past fall. So we can all talk about, well, it won't hurt the Guard, we'll be fine. This idea that it will help recruiting, I will challenge that. I know a lot of young people that signed up since September 11, 2001. They absolutely know what they're signing up for, and they want to contribute and make a difference. Every time the National Guard has a federal mission and there are slots to fill, I can guarantee you there'll be 3 volunteers for every open slot there is. These young people joined to be something bigger than themselves, to be part of a team, to do important things, to get back to their community. And if they turn into a Homeland Security force, just waiting for the next flood to maybe respond, hopefully be well trained, that's not what they signed up for. So I do think this would hurt recruiting. I do think it puts federal resourcing at risk. And I do think it puts both our country and our state at risk if we use the National Guard to make this political point.
Thank you, General Dorman. How does it feel to be a civilian?
Everybody asked me where I get my vintage clothing, and I said I bought it new in the 90s when I was the assistant state's attorney. So I see one other flowered tie. I was worried because everybody wore flowered ties in the 90s, and that's all I own. So
well, it's pretty impressive that you can still fit into your vintage clothes.
All right, there's not much here. They're going to talk about his tie and his jacket. But hey, listen, all right, we got to talk about this. So Major General retired Alan Dorman's testimony. It's a dazzling display of storytelling and nostalgia all wrapped into a flower tie. And as you can see in the video, a 1990s, I don't know, what is that, Hugo Boss or Brooks Brother knockoff suit. Unfortunately, it had little to do with the actual merits or the lack thereof of his opposition to defend the Guard legislation. What I witnessed here was a troubling example of the executive branch blatantly interfering with the legislative branch. Let's be clear about this. In our representative form of government, the House of Representatives and the State Senate are supposed to debate, vote on, and pass legislation that reflects the will of the people that they serve. The executive branch, where Dorman, this guy, General Dorman, now resides as the governor's chief of staff, they have the authority to either sign or veto the legislation that the legislature passes. They shouldn't meddle in the deliberative process. Yet here he is. Now he's not in his uniform, thank God, right? But this wise old general turned political operative, he is treating the legislature like a knee pad wearing service organization for the governor's office. It's shameful, and it's part of a disturbing pattern across the country of the executive overreach. So now let's talk about his testimony. It was filled with kind of grandpa-like storytelling and spinning tales of history and the battles from generations past. It's actually kind of cool. I love hearing those stories, but it has no place in this environment. What it lacked was any meaningful connection to the actual Defend the Guard bill. You see, I think his opposition to the legislation was a non sequitur, a rambling series of anecdotes that pivoted awkwardly into why he opposed the bill, without ever tying his stories to the actual merits of the legislation. It was kind of a rhetorical equivalent of a Matlock episode gone wrong. Endearing, maybe, but a little bit ultimately incoherent. Let's not also forget the irony that dripped from every word he said, the irony that was so thick he couldn't even see it himself. He spoke about the well-established legal principles that supposedly justify ignoring the Constitution's requirement for a declaration of war. Yet, he also acknowledged that North Dakota is part of an overall force structure of the U.S. military. General, you can't have it both ways. If we're part of the force structure, then you know damn well that this bill doesn't threaten our readiness or our resources, right? We're either part of the force structure or we're not. And we're not part of the force structure because we have the ability to go to wars illegally. It's not true. It's not connected. Then came the most offensive part of his testimony. For me, it was his shameless invocation of the sacrifice and the pride of service members' families. Let me be clear. God, I just sound like President Obama. Let me be clear. Let's start that again. There is no more sacred price paid than the loss of a loved one in war. But to invoke their pride while simultaneously refusing to address whether they had those sacrifices were necessary or justified is a disgusting emotional manipulation, General, and you should be ashamed of yourself. You don't get to have it both ways. Either you stand up and say those sacrifices were worth it, or you admit that we've been sending our best and our brightest to die in undeclared, unwinnable wars that serve no American interest, and that we've allowed politics to get in the way and cost them their lives. And speaking of those wars, let's look at your generation's track record, General. Desert Storm, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq twice, Syria, Yemen, Horn of Africa. By my count, that's a win-loss record 0-8. So, sir, respectfully, your credibility in this discussion is at best non-existent. You've led us into conflict after conflict with no clear objective, no plan for victory, and no accountability. So maybe it's time for you and your suit to sit this one out. Have a pudding cup. Have a little tuggy to a Golden Girls rerun. I don't care what you do, but call it a day. Bedtime comes early at this stage in life, doesn't it, General? I cannot listen to another one of your driveling lies and grandpa folklore story tells. It's time to stop, General. You've been lying for too long. Well, all right. That may have gotten a little personal, and I apologize, but I'm frustrated at just the open irony and lies that come out of these men's mouth. I think they all get trained at the same place, or they can take their marching orders from the same unelected bureaucrats at the NGB. So this hearing was equal parts ironic, occasionally entertaining. But on the pro side, I thought Representative Matt Heilman, he nailed it. I thought he did a good job. He stuck to the facts. He laid out the intent of the bill. And he showed that Defend the Guard is about restoring constitutional order and protecting those who serve. I thought his performance was principled and rooted in American values, and I look forward to working with him more. For the opposition, I thought Representative Jeremy Olson stumbled over the bill's intent. He served up fear-based, baseless arguments about bureaucratic hurdles, I think is what his words were. Here's a pro tip for you, Jared. If you're going to oppose the legislation, at least do a little bit of homework. Brigadier General Mitchell Johnson, whose fear-mongering and contradictions I thought were stunning. He claimed that North Dakota wouldn't be a priority for resources while admitting that it's also part of the force structure. Which is it? General, you got to pick one. He also completely missed the point. Guard members shouldn't be involved in unconstitutional wars, joystick, or boots on the ground. Then back to the retired General Dorman. He capped things off with a nostalgia-filled storytelling hour that had no connections to the bill's merits or the principles. and I thought he had a shameful invocation of service members' families. So the hearing reinforced while Defend the Guard is critical. This is about protecting the Constitution and the lives of the National Guardsmen and women who serve. Endless wars have cost way too high, so it's time for accountability. So I want you to, please, go to defendtheguard.us. Sign up, enlist in our movement. Chip in a few bucks to help the cause. Believe it or not, getting these hearings in states takes a lot of groundwork, a lot of effort, and it costs money. And we are a small dollar donation grassroots organization. So please chip in 15, 20, 25, 50 bucks. Make it a monthly donation. I promise we don't waste a penny of your money. Find your state bill sponsor. Go back to the beginning of the defendtheguard.us page. Click on your state. Find your bill sponsor and support their hearing. And if you need help with your testimony or additional learning on the bill, reach out. We're here for you. This movement is about restoring principles and protecting those who serve. So let's get to it. Let's make history together.